Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. So I met Paul and Joy at the WMOA conference, where I was talking about what we're doing in Bedford.
Let me just explain. WMOA stands for Westchester Municipal Officials Association.
Thank you, because I couldn't remember that. Because I was hoping somebody here would remember that. And we were talking, we came as a group to sort of talk about what we think is important in our community, which is making Bedford neuro-inclusive. And I'm going to speak specifically to what we did in Bedford because everybody's town's a little bit different, everybody's needs are different, so I don't want to pretend to know what you've done. I want to tell you our experience and offer to be supportive in any way that we can. And part of that, I think, is just the numbers alone, and I'll talk to the numbers about what is happening in terms of diagnoses and neurodiversity, and I'll move along from there. So,
is it all right to say that you and I know each other because we both have neurodiverse children?
That is absolutely all right to say, yeah. And so I'm definitely invested in building a better world for my child and everybody's children. And I find that what my husband likes to say to me is, don't say why it's good for me, say why it's good for other people. Mm-hmm. And so in addition to the fact that it is good for us, and it's the world we want to live in, it's good for business, it's good for real estate agents, it's good for communities. And so we are a little bit on a crusade, and we're getting a lot of traction, and a lot of towns are buying into it. And
I have to say that I'm familiar with your program. I talked at length with legislator Erica Pierce and Shari Resnasha. Yeah. And you know, my daughter works in that sphere. She's a BCBA, and I'm also very encouraged. Your website is great. I love it, and I hope you'll describe it for people. And it is something that I would love to see us do as a town.
Okay. I know I'm supposed to know how to advance this, and I'm looking at slides, but I have no idea. What am I supposed to just hit return to enter to move ahead? There we go. Yeah. So part of the reason we started this in town was I'd heard a lot of stories. One of them was a story about a mother who told me she took her daughter to the supermarket, and the daughter was pulling everything off the shelves and having a meltdown, and she was kicked out of the supermarket. And even when I say that, I feel like crying. And this was a parent who just wanted to go grocery shopping. And she's never gone back to the supermarket before. I've met a lot of parents and families who don't leave their homes because they have children who are disruptive or who are loud or who stim or who have behaviors that are not what other people might consider the norm. And as a result, they feel ostracized in their communities. And we decided we didn't want that in Bedford. And I decided I didn't want to live in the world, and I live in Bedford. So that's sort of where we began. So our goals in Bedford were to make the town of Bedford accessible to and inclusive of every resident with neurodivergent disabilities, to educate the community about the nature of disabilities, to identify and eliminate barriers to inclusion, to enlist key stakeholders and partners, and to identify, spearhead, and support initiatives to assure that every resident is engaged, included, and welcome in Bedford's community. So we made a goal for what we wanted to do. What we didn't want to do was just ragtag, decide this is important, we think it's important. We wanted the town to buy in. And we wanted to know that there was an official stamp that came from the town. And I believe, and this is why I'm sitting in front of you, that it is important to have the town board take an official position about it, because that is, by the way, this is my daughter, in case you all want to know, she's calling to FaceTime. It's important for the town board to own it and to have an official stamp, and that's where we went. So just to back up, by the numbers, in case anybody doesn't know, 1 in 36 children are diagnosed with autism. That's huge. Mm-hmm. 1 in 5 people have learning differences. I bet if I went around this table right now, that means there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of us one of us sitting at this table or in the audience thinks a little bit differently, has a slight little, I did an exercise yesterday in a group with people and I said, how many of you ever get anxious? 5 people shut up. How many of you ever, do this with your hands when you're sitting or do this with your hair? Okay? That's stimming in a different form. So we're familiar with what stimming looks like.
Can you just define that for everybody?
Stimming is when, how do I say this? One, when you see somebody with autism who flaps.
Repetitive behavior.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that is a way that some people find that they can regulate their own body. And I think we all have like nail biting. We all have little tiny things that we do that ground us that we're not even aware of. The way we typically do it, nobody looks at us askance, and we are considered to be normal. The way somebody else does it, which is flapping their hands or jumping up and down or walking back and forth. I have a friend whose son had the police called on him. He was at the bus stop, and he was walking back and forth, and somebody sitting at the bus stop called the police because they thought he was on drugs. I don't know what they thought. But here's a 24-year-old young man who had the police called on him because that's how he regulated his body. So an estimated 75 million people in the United States live with an intellectual disability. An estimated 5 to 15% of school-age children have sensory disorders, and we're talking about typically developing kids. We're not talking about somebody with any kind of a diagnosis. And also 50,000 young people with autism in the U.S. turn 21 every year. And I don't need to tell you what happens to a child when you're 21 and all of the services stop, your funding stops, your programming stops. We call it falling off a cliff. I assume you have the same language. And you're living in a world that doesn't recognize your child anymore. And to me, this is a big opportunity for empathy, for education, for change. People with disabilities are the largest minority in this country. If you think about them as a group, they are the largest minority in the country. Okay. These are not going to be relevant to you, but I bring them up for you to have some kind of context. Part of how we determined that Bedford was a place where our residents and our community would want the kinds of changes that we were advocating was that we looked in the public school system to see how many IEPs. An IEP is, you all know what an IEP is, Individualized Education Program, okay? It means that if you have a student who's in the public school system who learns a little bit differently, they have to have a separate education plan that helps support them in the learning environment. And that is what we call special education or special services, depending on how you define it. So in Bedford alone, okay, we had 23,000 students with IEPs. That tells you we have 23,000 families living in our area who go to either Bedford School District or Katona-Lewisboro School District in our surrounding area that have a kid who has something. I don't know what they have, but they have something that requires them to have an individualized education plan. That means that I've got families, 23,000 families in that area, who have a child for whom some kind of accommodation is required. And the accommodation doesn't just exist in the school system, it's when you walk out into the community. You can't isolate kids and families. So you're going into the supermarket, like the family I told you about. You're going to the bus stop. You're going to restaurants. You're going to stores. You're going out. And unless the community recognizes you, feels empathy, feels the desire and the responsibility to accommodate, then these families are going to be disaffected. Conversely, if you have a community that is able to say, we are neuro-inclusive, we have trained our real estate agents in Bedford to be able to say when a family comes in, by the way, this is what we have. And I'll get into some of the things that we've already changed. But it will make Greenburgh the kind of community where families will want to live, especially if they have a child who's even a little bit different. We're not talking about a lot different. We're talking a little bit different. So that's why, and then the one thing that we thought was important, an estimated 30% of the county are people with disabilities. Their families and their friends vote. And that was a big thing. We said to, and this is something I talk to Erica about all the time. You got voters. And if you're supporting your residents, they'll come back and vote for you.
And more importantly is just making not only the children feel welcome, but their families too.
Correct.
Their parents, their brothers and sisters. I mean, it's got to be so hard for a sibling who is young and doesn't have a clear understanding yet. And when people are punitive and judgmental because of a behavior, stimming behavior, for instance, then it has a detrimental effect on those children too.
Totally. I mean, one of the things we say is, the first lesson we try to teach people is, don't stare, smile. First thing.
Yes.
And you know that when you have a child who's either having a meltdown, even if you have a typically developing child having a meltdown, people stare, and then they judge, and then they think you're a bad parent. So part of this process is just to educate.
Yeah, so talk about your process and what it is that, how you educate us and how we help educate the rest of our residents.
Okay, so the first thing we did is we had our town board establish a neurodiversity task force. We sent out, I assume you have a newsletter, and I can share our whole process. I'm happy to talk you through it, okay?
Yes.
Great.
So we had a newsletter that went out. We invited the entire community to say, who's interested in this topic? Come on in. And I met a lot of people, actually, that I didn't know in the community who've now become both friends and members of the Inclusive Initiative. We all met in the town board office with our town supervisor and several of our town board members, one of whom joined the committee and headed up one of our task force committees. We divided into 3 committees. We had a survey committee, because we didn't want to pretend that we knew the answers. We went out into the community, distributed a survey, talked to everybody. What do you want? What do you see? What are you getting? What do you need? I'm happy to share our survey with you. Then we had a committee that looked at training. That's all we did. We did a deep dive into every single kind of training that exists out there and came back with recommendations for our town board. And then we had a resources committee. So if you go to the town of Bedford, and again, these may be what you want. You may think they don't work for you. You want something else. But this is what, based on our work together as a group, we all decided these were the 3 areas that we were most focused on and we thought would have the biggest impact on the community. So if you go to the Town of Bedford website now, you will see a resource page. I don't know if you looked at our town page.
I did.
That resource page means that if you're a member of our community who suddenly has a diagnosis or has a child and wants help, you can go to that resource page and immediately find recommendations for dentists, for rec programs, for, the whole list. So it took us about 6 to 8 months to do that work, meeting, researching, getting our surveys back, yeah.
Most schools, they have, programs for those with special needs. So are the schools heavily involved in the committee also?
Interesting, kind of. I don't know what you have here. We have SEPTO in, oh, good, I'm not the only one who didn't know what SEPTO was. Special Education Parent Teacher Organization, kind of like a PTA, but for parents with special needs. Maybe you have that in your public school district. I don't know about Greenberg. I have found, and I don't know what kind of situations you've had. I don't know if you follow what happens in Bedford. We've had some bad situations in Bedford with special ed. I don't know if you saw that. With a student, it's heartbreaking. I'm not even going to tell you the story. You can Google it. I have found that the school districts, one of them has been extremely bought in, and one of them not. And I don't even know why not. And I've gone to both, what are they called? Supervisors, what are the Board of Ed teachers called? I forget, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, whoever heads the school board and the
superintendent of schools?
Superintendent. I've met superintendents for both of the school districts, thank you. And it's sort of an interesting dynamic.
Well, I guess maybe they think the realm is just school and they're not thinking of the extension of what happens outside of school, which is, so much of their students' life is outside of school.
They're also not thinking that they can learn anything from anybody else.
Oh, well, that's not good.
No. And also, and I don't need to tell you this, there's two separate tracks. There's a special ed track, and then there's the other track. And what we are trying to educate the schools about is that they should not be two separate tracks that you have to integrate, and that all of your general ed teachers need to learn about neurodiversity. Because you have a kid who's maybe no diagnosis, but is sitting there doing that with his feet or his hands, and a gen ed teacher needs to understand that in a larger context. So I can only speak to our school district. I don't know about yours.
Right. How many members are involved in your committee?
Well, so going back to the task force, we presented to the town board. We made very specific recommendations. Let's see if I remember what they were. We definitely, hold on one second. Recommendations. We definitely suggested that they have a website page, which they've done. We suggested they all get trained. We've trained our town supervisor and every one of the committee chairs. Exactly. We suggested training, largely. We suggested, I said this already, I think, that the website has to incorporate their changes and list the buy-in for the town. And we also suggested that the police department have a registry for families who have young adults with any kind of disability, even if it's a physical handicap, so that if, God forbid, there's a fire or a police incident, the police or the fire people are aware before they go in, so they're talking to each other. So we put that on the town website as well.
That's great.
And that's something that we also want the schools to buy into, because that's how we're going to access our parents. The schools need to tell their parents that they can register with the police department.
If I may add something, a young lady came into my office right before the summer. Town clerk, hi. And she asked me, are there any summer programs for for her special needs child? And I said, come into my office, did a little Googling, and I spoke with the school that her child is going to, and they only had an academic program. And that's when I made some phone calls and found out that the school where she was going, they sent me to one of the presenters that night, and I can't think of the organization. And I said,
Oh, I know exactly who that is, Nancy Bellini.
yes.
And it was East something Rec. I see her
Yes.
every day and I can never remember her
Yes.
name.
It
Yeah.
was- and what happened was, we literally we came to, she was so thankful because everybody only had academic programs. And I was like, that's not fair to a kid who wants to be a kid during the summer. And so then they was like, oh, we're going to be presenting at the WOMA. And I was like, I'm scheduled to go. So I ended up speaking to them that evening.
good.
And so it was just, it was just an amazing, just to, again, get educated on it, and the presentation, and just the fact that I was even able to help one of our residents just by pointing them in the right direction. So unfortunately, the school where her son went, they did not have any resources. I had to call the program that came and spoke. So it's a need. So I'm
There's
just letting
definitely
you,
a
just
need.
confirming
Yeah.
there's a need.
Yeah.
So,
And-
so your recommendation, what would you think we could do in the town? Should we do the same type of thing, form a committee, and what's like the best initial steps that we could take?
I think you probably should have a resolution that the town board adopts that makes it official, that you're invested, and you can look at the language. Our resolution is on our website, on the town board website. So you can make a resolution, and you can go through the same process we went through, if that makes sense to you. Because again, you need every business to buy in. You can't force this down anybody's throat. You want people to do it.
Right.
And you're perfect because you're going to get out there and speak on behalf of your daughter. right? And you were going to explain why it's so important. And we had a town board member in Bedford who had taken care of her aging uncle who had intellectual disabilities. I don't think it was Down syndrome. And from when she was a child, and he was 19. And she still tells the story about how she couldn't get him a haircut because he had such sensory issues.
Do you think it would make sense, because obviously there's no borders when you're dealing with disabilities, it's a problem that affects people all over. Would it make sense for, say, that, I'm not sure if this is something that you'd be interested in for the town, say, to form a committee and almost be like a step committee to, what you're doing,
You mean
working.
a sister program
It's just
to
almost-
Bedford, is that what you mean?
Yeah, because they've already done a lot of this, and if we
Oh.
basically, let's say we
They have a
start out-
roadmap that we can follow.
Well, I'm even thinking of even where, let's say Greenberg joins forces with your committee initially, because, maybe we may get 10 people the first couple months, and then it will start growing. This way we could almost do the same things you're doing at the same time.
Well, that
think-
doesn't make sense geographically.
I'm just
I
asking.
think what may be akin to that is if we establish a committee, they can audit and learn from them, have a meeting or two
Right.
maybe to learn what they did,
Like
what
an
their
advisory
process is and what they
capacity.
do.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a short term, but not
But I
necessarily
just
an
know
alliance.
that, for years, we've tried doing like a lot of, we've worked hard trying to give the developmentally, challenged, jobs. We've set up programs where we've helped people who are unemployed find work, and we've been successful. There's one person right now who's finishing up at the town park as an employee, and he now is going to be working at a supermarket right after the summer is over. There was somebody years ago, number of years ago, he was an intern in my office, very autistic, very loud. Nobody really was thrilled with him but me.
Right.
And he eventually became a police officer in the state of
Oh, wow.
Washington.
That's
So it was a real success story.
Yeah.
And we have people coming in, about 6 or 7 developmentally disabled individuals coming in my office at least once a week, and they've been doing that for at least 10 years.
I think you have to have a real infrastructure in place. You can't do a one-off. I mean, it's great. All these stories are great. But I think you have to have set a tone, yeah. And you have to have be official. And I think every town has to own it. And I think you have to find parents who want to own it. And for our inclusive initiative, which we have now, and thank you for looking at the website, we're constantly recruiting. And we're,
Wendy, let's talk about it further. We can talk offline. You've given us a great introduction, and we certainly would like to know more about it.
I
and
just
we
want to
can
mention one
report
other thing.
back.
Rochelle Stolzenberg, who lives in
I was thinking that.
Ardsley,
Ardsley.
she
Yeah.
has
Well-
a son who's super personable.
I don't think we should be mentioning individuals.
Okay.
Okay,
I
there are
think we
people in the
should- yeah,
community who
yeah.
would benefit.
But I'm just saying, one of the thoughts that she has, and one of the goals that I've had would be to set up with assisted living facilities,
Yep.
an employment program where
Yep.
as
All
as
of
children
those
age
things.
in place, there should be housing, employment, and housing. And I feel that the town, and even maybe Bedford, because there's a lot of assisted living facilities all over, and I feel a lot of the a lot of young people with special needs, they have super personalities. They would be excellent dealing with seniors who are
Agreed.
basically lonely.
Yep.
And they could be great friends. So I feel that we should be, as a government, almost requiring the future assisted living facilities to do some hiring and to have room and board. And that to me would be like
Let's
one initiative.
explore that, but let's get the process started, and
Thank you
we
so much.
really
You know what,
appreciate
I
it.
think
Thank
we
you so
help.
much.
We will be reaching out to
And
you.
Yeah.
for sure.
feel free to reach out. And so nice to meet you. Thank you for
Nice to
having
meet
me.
you too. Thank you.
And see ya.
Okay.
Bye. Nice to see you.
You too.
Thank you so much, appreciate you. I do
Okay.
want to say that I do follow neuroscience because our job makes sure we sign it, so thank you so much.
Okay.
The great
Wherever you
organization, so thank you.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.